Hi, welcome to the bathtub. Scott Bradfield. We're we got the non-pixelated water. We got no fonts. We're post-tech before everyone else was pre-tech. That's because we're marching forward in the bathtub. That's the only visual aid that we have in the bathtub this week. We had two or three things. Basically, I did two episodes in which I said I would probably never be able to finish them, about books I've enjoyed rereading and that I've reread a lot of times over the years. So two or three things interesting happened. As I sort of expected, as soon as I did like two complete shows of books off the shelves that I've read 4 or 5 times, that was a sort of rough cutoff point of it. I knew I'd find. I kept saying, "Well, God, I've read this one. There's just more times than that," or I've reread this one. So anyway, we can never do a top 10 list in this bathtub. And as we did, I remember a couple of years ago, I did like my favorite short story collections. I think I ended up doing like four lists of my favorite short story collections. Anyway, we're not very good at ranking. We're not good rankers. We're basically bathers. We try to look for ways to read books that has nothing to do with the stuff you're supposed to do. We never look for themes. So if there's a theme, we don't give a fuck. Excuse me, Granny, kids. We don't give an F about the themes of the stuff. We don't care if it's social value or if it teaches us any good cultural lessons. We just want to have a good time in the bathtub. That's all we're looking for. And these are books that, for various different ways, have just given me happy pleasures in the bathtub. Now, the basic premise, before I go into something else, the basic premise was this would be 4 or 5 times I've read them just selfishly in the bathtub. Now, there's kind of, sort of, slightly, it sort of bends a little bit. So there's, for example, certain books that I have read Catcher in the Rye at least 4 times or 5 times in my life just because I really love the book and I love J.D. Salinger. So I've read it 4 or 5 times. I've probably read it another 10 times when I taught it, because I taught for many years. I taught modern novel. And whenever I put a book on my syllabus, I always reread it. Because I would forget. I forgot so much. I don't remember books very well, and I read it again, and I would want to be able to talk over with the students. So I have to have Catcher in the Rye on my most reread books. I've reread it at least probably 15 to 20 times, much like not as much as Lolita, but right up there. So it was crazy not to have that on the list. I have a few more. I want this kind of pickup. This is the pickup edition of most reread books in my library. While I was doing this is a weird thing. Maybe I was hallucinating or something. Or it may have been some flashbacks of my high school mescaline experiences. But as soon as I posted these, I started getting feeds from other booktubers who were all exactly the same time as I was doing these most reread books. And they were all thanking each other for the idea of rereading, of talking about lists of their top 10 most reread books. Terrific. I'm really glad they're all doing that. They were all thanking each other, and they all seem to have had their own little thing going at the same time. So we must be part of some zeitgeist. Some zeitgeist is going through the booktubing community. But I had no idea. I didn't have any idea about it. And we're not doing top 10. We've got about 30 by now. Finally, one last thing I wanted to say is it probably says something about my life that I can read so many books. I could be my age and have read so many books 4 or 5 times. We had a young writer who checks in once in a while, and he said, "I've only read one book 3 times." Well, he's only 20. So, when you're 20, you only reread, you don't reread that much. But when you get to be 68, it's like somebody in this room is 68. You wouldn't believe how much time you can reread books. And I had to say that it was either a hugely waste of life or kind of a perfect life. I don't know. Things must have gone pretty well for me to find time to reread so many books I love. Anyway, here's some more. We actually did a couple episodes on Samuel Beckett's 3 novels. Beckett often said that there were 3 unrelated novels, and I think that's fair. Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. This is my second copy of this. I literally reread this book so often it fell apart. I love these 3 novels. I do think that they're different. They're very structurally different. They're very narratively different. The first time I read them, I was sort of okay. I reread them again, And I went through a period in my 40s or 50s, where I just sat down and read this book over and over again over a year. I just really had a great time reading it. I found it kind of a fascinating read. I also taught it, but of the books I've read just for my personal pleasure, I got to say these three novels I've probably reread on my own as much as any books I've ever read. And I didn't teach it very often. The other thing I wanted to talk about was a lot of the books we don't reread are still, this is not our favorite books. They're just something about rereading them that give me personal pleasure. It has nothing to do with whether anyone else should read them, or they're thematically important, or they're important to the history of Western literature or world literature. Screw all those things. Just selfish reading. One of my favorite books was The Grapes of Wrath. I read this when I was about 17, 18, and I've never been interested in rereading it. Isn't that weird? I love this book. I remember it very fondly. I constantly give it to people to read, but I don't need to reread it again. The whole ambience, the whole feeling of that book is still with me. I do enjoy rereading, and I reread about 4 times probably In Dubious Battle. Why? I have no idea. I just liked rereading that one. Here's another one. We talked a bit about those Jack Kirby books. I reread the first 2 or 3 volumes of the Doonesbury collections at least 5, 6 times. I would go through periods where I would just reread them, and it would be really fun. And I had my own copies. I remember staying at the Klutz. They pulled them off the shelf. I'd just sit in the chair and read old Doonesbury comics. And I've always got through the first 2 volumes. I'd like to finish them, read all the way through them because I missed so many. But those first 2 volumes I've at least read 5 or 6 times. Here's another one I kept thinking about. I'm sure I read Hawksbill Station by Robert Silverberg 5 times. There's a novella version. There's a novel version. We're big fans of Robert Silverberg at the Bathtub, and mainly his short stories. I always thought when I was growing up, this guy really knew he always could write wonderfully perfect little short stories. His novels I never was as wild about. I mean, I liked some of them, but I haven't been as tempted to reread them. But this one kind of long novella, I just really enjoy reading it. And every once in a while I pick it up and read it again. I think I've read it twice since we moved since we've been doing these talks. And we've probably talked about it before. Here's another challenge. The Scarlet Letter. The books you're supposed to read for school tend to be kind of books you don't want to read in the bathtub. I was assigned this in high school and took it in the bathtub because I was reading books in the bathtub since I was yay high, and I loved it. This is one of my favorite classic novels that you're supposed to read, and I have read it and whether I read it 4 or 5 times just for myself, I'm pretty sure I never did. But I read it for class. I read it for my doctoral dissertation. I read it to teach it, and I taught it very often. And I love Hawthorne. I love everything I've ever read by Hawthorne. I even, after the 3rd or 4th go-through, I even enjoyed the long, some people consider boring introduction called The Custom House, which is how he survived being a writer by getting a political appointment. It's a wonderful novel. And every time I read it, I love it, and I assign it for classes so I can reread it. It kind of breaks the rules, so it doesn't quite work. Here's one of the thriller books I read. I'm sure I read 4 or 5 times by myself. I read it as a kid. Again, not just books as you read as a kid, but then you keep rereading. So when I was 14 or 15, 16, you can't put it down when you read it. Postman Always Rings Twice by James M. Cain. He wrote a lot of good books, but this one is very, very short and just captures. It's just bang, bang, bang. Gets all the way through, and you're totally wrapped up in this book. It's a terrific read. And I must have read it a couple times when I was young. I reread it as I got older. As a writer, the other thing, often as a writer, I always like to read books that are just really, really well done, and they have a certain type of clean approach to writing fiction. And I would read this as an adult just because I liked this book. But I also taught it, so there you go. We talked a bit about it, the stories of Tobias Wolff. I have reread these selfishly in the tub 4 or 5 times, and often assign them. These are his first 3 books. This is a cool edition. We have one we talked about this book before. It's the Picador edition, which has Wolff's first three books, including The Barracks Thief. And the first one is called In the Garden of the North American Martyrs. The second one is called Back in the World. And then there's a short novel called The Barracks Thief. These are wonderful stories. And every time I start it, I love it. I reread it almost from cover to cover. And I've also assigned all three of these books in classes, but 4 or 5 times selfishly. We talked about this. Again, I can't, all those other ones we talked about, I have reread The Sound of the Fury and As I Lay Dying at least 10 times. 4 or 5 times selfishly, as we did both of them recently, just for the bathtub, just to talk selfishly about these 2 novels that I love by Faulkner. And I've had this edition for a long time, and they're two of the books I've reread the most. I can't list them. I can't rank them. The Complete Peanuts, like the Doonesbury's by Gary Trudeau. I've read and reread Peanuts since I was 6, and I get just as much pleasure out of them now. And having the complete edition, having read all through the complete, so I didn't miss any. I'll probably start those again if I live long enough, which I'm planning to. Is that it? Oh no, here's what. God, anyway, this will be the last one. The Voyages of Dr. Doolittle. Here's another book we talked about. I think we were putting together pandemic reading lists for people to read just for fun. Isn't that a cool old cover? That's the first American edition. My friend Clute helped me buy these because the first proper edition of the Voyages of Dr. Doolittle was an American publication. And these are very politically incorrect now. But these spoiled me for life. I've talked about it before. The thing about having the animals tell their stories, I mean, I've basically half of my writing career, as they call it, career, is about is been influenced by the Dr. Doolittle books and by Peanuts. Those are the two biggest influences on my literary sensibility. The idea of letting these animals talk for themselves and speak and tell their stories. This is the first one that's told from Tommy Stubbins' point of view. I guess there were several Dr. Doolittle books before this that were third person, but I love the ones that were Tommy Stubbins tells. He's the young boy who goes to live with Dr. Doolittle. And I've written about these books many times. I've reread them since I was a kid. I've reread them to write about them as an adult, and they're on my shelf to be reread again because I love all those late Dr. Doolittle novels, all the ones from The Voyages of Dr. Doolittle and forward. And this is not a perfect copy. It was pretty beat up when I bought it, but it had, look at this, beautiful. I remember getting that at the library as a kid, and that almost caught me at the beginning. And then the story's so wonderful. It wouldn't have worked. The picture by itself isn't going to do it, but there's like illustrations from the different adventures in the stories. Have nothing to do with the silly but sometimes fun Eddie Murphy movies. Anyway, I think I've done it. I know I'm going to find some others, but I had to bring those up because I had reread these books as many times as all those others we spoke about. Okay, happy bathing. Stay safe. Do all the things you're not supposed to do in the bathtub, including reading books that you're not supposed to read for school. Take care.